The Advanced Study Institute is meant to take on some topical concern and advance our thinking in some ways about mental health in context. And we're very fortunate this year to have with us a very wide range of colleagues from different disciplines to begin to engage with perhaps one of the largest possible contexts we could imagine in terms of mental health of individuals and communities and indeed our whole species, and that is the whole set of dilemmas surrounding a kind of ecological view of mental health, a view of mental health that is centered on our recognition of occupying this planet together with each other, with other species, with an environment that is increasingly showing its fragility, and that demands from us some very serious rethinking about how we live our lives and what the aims are of our lives, and within that, as one set of consequences, how we think about mental health, wellness, and our interventions. This program occurs in the context of the Division of Social and Transcultural Psychiatry, which is a program that goes back to the 1950s here at McGill, and which began oriented around a set of concerns about training international mental health workers, psychiatrists in particular, who came here from other former Commonwealth countries for training in psychiatry, and who themselves raised questions about the relevance of what they were learning to the particular context that they worked in. And rather than simply viewing that as a translation problem or a marketing problem or some kind of, what can we say, academic imperialism to impose our frameworks on other people, this was seen as an opportunity for an ongoing dialogue, for learning from each other about the different contexts that people occupy around the world. And the program has continued in that spirit up to the present, but with a kind of renewed focus on the culture of psychiatry, the culture of mental health itself, trying to understand what are the knowledge systems, the value systems, the forms of life that we're embedded in, and that to varying degrees we take for granted in our everyday practice. And can we throw those into relief in some way that lets us think in a fresh and creative way about what we're doing? This is the list of the previous advanced study institutes we've had, although the summer school's gone on for some 23 years. We've started this about 16 years ago. And you can see we began with the politics of trauma there at the bottom, and we've moved through a whole series of topics, driven partly by our current concerns, by grants that certain people in our network had, and so on, that would motivate bringing together a group of scholars. Our topic today, as you'll see in the program, is on thinking about psychiatry on this whole planet in some ways. And in a sense, it's meant to move us a bit from the idea of global mental health, which has become a rallying cry in recent years for trying to directly address the profound inequalities that exist around the globe in mental health and health in general, as well as, of course, in every other domain of life we might think about. But as we'll be discussing, that kind of thinking has been very heavily driven by a particular view of the global economic system as the main driver, the main exigency that frames problems and in a sense offers up us certain kinds of solutions. Last month in Washington, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the WHO had a high-level meeting at the urging of various advocates in the global mental health movement to embrace the idea of global mental health being a global development priority. And that's, many of us think that's a positive thing in terms of at least considering the relevance of mental health and the importance of allocating significant resources to trying to improve people's access to mental health services and grassroots mental health promotion programs and so on. But the way the problem is phrased, I mean, first of all, even to bring that kind of idea forward on the global agenda involved a kind of huge marketing campaign. And like most marketing campaigns, that ends up being a kind of hyperbolic exercise in just how absolutely important and what a sine qua non this set of issues is. And in the process, unfortunately, sometimes what gets marginalized is the intricate web of interconnections between things and the mutual dependencies of things. And it's that kind of more ecological thinking that I hope we're going to be foregrounding today throughout all of our discussions, and in a sense trying to consider the sense in which thinking about psychiatry, not from the point of view just of globalization, but from processes we could think of as planetary processes, that is, things that are about our globe as a whole, that are in some ways impersonal, that involve beings other than human beings, and all of those forces could be relevant to our discussion. One way this has been framed in recent years, since about 2000 or so, is in the vocabulary of the Anthropocene, taking the way in which geologists have divided up very long epochs of life on this planet that are visible in the strata of archaeological digs and so on, and recognizing that in the past few years geologically, this little thin line at the very end here, have represented a profound transformation of processes on our planet. And the evidence for that comes in many forms. Here is a picture of just in 300 years how human populations have changed their distribution and the ways that they live, toward a huge amount of urbanization, toward a huge amount of development of arable land in new ways and new forms of activity, and the loss of lots of arable land or transformation of it. And then there's any host of indicators that one can take about the environment that show profound changes. Of great interest to us here today and to all of us all the time are the changes in greenhouse gases that are profoundly affecting the way in which the Earth traps and retains heat, and so that we're living through this profound transformation right now. And there are all kinds of different indicators one can latch on to. This includes, I don't know how you can read unfortunately this is just a gestural slide rather than something that actually contains readable information at the moment, but just to tell you that among other things, in addition to showing things like the level of water use or level of CO2 in the atmosphere, it also has the number of McDonald's restaurants on it and so on. So many kinds of things that are growing exponentially over a period of the last few centuries, the last few decades, indeed the last few years. And it's that overall pattern of all these sort of exponentially growing indicators that is what is so arresting and that demands our attention. This is not a totally new recognition. In fact, you can trace the recognition of these things back hundreds of years, but there was a period in the 60s and 70s when people were trying to begin this kind of to get a picture of this kind of context we're living in, to build more or less intricate models of the interdependencies of different processes, and then to project those forward with ominous implications, with the suggestion that what will inevitably happen with exponential growth at some point is a collapse of human populations, of the viability of our environment, and so on. And although those particular models and have been thoroughly challenged and viewed as perhaps doubtful in some ways, the overall thrust of concern about the idea of indefinite growth, I think, is now well accepted, about the problems of indefinite growth and the need to think in other terms. And that's exemplified now by a whole series of papers and papers in the Lancet, which indeed have engaged not only with the idea with the Anthropocene, but also with the idea of planetary medicine in some ways. So the idea that this attention to the ways in which the environment is being dramatically transformed and the pervasive impact of that on every aspect of human health has moved from a kind of marginal critique of people who are the distant early warning systems of humanity to a central concern even in sort of mainstream medical institutions and journals, and precisely the same kinds of figures and projections, in this case with increasing amounts of data to lend substance to their the picture of these trajectories, have become fodder for exactly these kinds of discussions in healthcare. Behind that, then, is a call to think ecologically, to understand the ways in which we're embedded in various kinds of mutual dependencies with our environment, with each other, with both human and non-human systems, and to trace the ways in which those influence health. And that will be the broad arc of our discussion today, to begin with a picture of global economic systems and their relationship to ecological contexts, to the ways in which human activity psychology and human value systems and ways of life drive some of those processes and respond to them, and to raise questions then about the implications for the nature of our communities, the nature of our self-understanding, and ultimately for those of us who work at the sort of coalface of immediate human problems and problems of human communities, what the implications are for how we conceptualize problems and how indeed we might intervene in ways that improve the situation rather than aggravate it. So these are the sort of, just to sort of get to the direct link to mental health, because we're going to be starting at a very broad level with fundamental questions about how our home is functioning. What we're facing, more or less inevitably at this point, are increasing levels of environmental disruption, degradation, and indeed catastrophe. That's going to lead, we're in the midst of the largest refugee crisis since World War II, with the ongoing war in Syria and other places, but we're likely to be facing even greater levels of forced migration as a result of changes in the planet. And so how we respond to that, what institutions we have internationally, and what kinds of reception people are able to find when they're fleeing for their lives, more or less, or for their livelihoods, is crucial. And although much of the rhetoric of globalization has tried to argue that this is a driver ultimately of greater equality, we also see parallel processes of exaggerating inequality. And given the fact that exactly the kinds of climate-related phenomena that we're going to be talking about are likely to hit hardest those parts of the world that are already the poorest and have the poorest infrastructure, there's reason for concern that these processes are going to amplify dramatically existing inequalities, in fact. Finally, we're all facing a sense of an uncertain future, and the sort of calm, comfortable, tacit assumption that we'll all go on in some kind of quasi-immortal way, if not individually, at least collectively, is really being seriously challenged. And we need to look at what the psychological implications of that are for the mental health of all of us, but particularly of youth who have a very different kind of horizon that they're looking at, to the extent that they're aware, along with all of us, of this larger context. So what does that mean for us in terms of interventions? I think our first intervention is on ourselves today, to try to improve our understanding of what we mean by these ecological and ecosocial systems, of how they function, of how we can grasp a bit of what's going on, which is not easy because we're deeply embedded in these systems. And then hopefully to identify some sustainable ways of life and of responding to these exigencies. And part of that, I think, has to do, and as we'll hear from some of our speakers today, has to do with value systems, with ways of life, with ways of understanding ourselves that have implications for our adaptation. So just having shown you that slide, I just have a few more slides that just sort of vividly depict some of these challenges, just to, again, acknowledge, although we tend to think of refugees and forced migration in terms of violence, increasingly environmental phenomena are going to be drivers of people moving en masse. Although we think that the global exchanges that are going on, the huge advances in information and communications technologies that have really woven the world together to be more of a global village than it ever has been before, we think of those as potentially fostering a kind of knowledge exchange and exchange of perspectives that could have a great, could be a great boon, could have a great impact in addressing inequalities. There's also evidence for forces that are driving greater and greater inequality in ways that are going to influence the framing of questions and sort of who gets to say what the priorities are and what the reasonable solutions would be. There's also some awareness that the environments that we live in, beyond just affording us either the possibility of some kind of a reasonable life and survival, have more subtle and pervasive effects on our sense of well-being and functioning. And so the same Lancet paper, alludes to a whole variety of studies that show the ways in which one's relationship to the natural environment, I put that in quotes, but the sense of connection with a larger environment around us, and with green space, with wilderness, with other kinds of things, is profoundly connected to people's sense of well-being. And with some studies we did years ago working with Indigenous people in Quebec showed, for example, that the level of mental health among Cree is associated with the amount of time people are able to spend in the bush. So that's just one example from within a particular cultural tradition that clearly valorizes that kind of aspect of way of life, but there probably are very important effects for all of us to be thought about. And this has led to calls for a kind of shift in how we think about public health toward a much more ecological view, not only in terms of the sort of abstract sense of taking a systems perspective to think about how things are interconnected, but more specifically to engage with the longue durée, with the large-scale changes that occur at the level of these very large planetary systems we're talking about, and with the impact of the environment as such. So we can think about this kind of ecological view as having the broadest sphere, which is not labeled here, which would be sort of the physical environment that people are embedded in, and then these different layers of the social world that we govern, and that in turn we can either experience those as the sources of our suffering, or we can draw from them forms of resilience that can be mobilized. But to do that, we have to have particular ways of looking at the world, and there's been a several decades struggle to find ways to articulate what kinds of values would allow us to go forward. And I invoke here this now sort of, what can we say, not discredited is not the right word, but now quaint notion of the Gaia hypothesis introduced by James Lovelock, the idea that the planet in some ways is itself one living being and is self-writing and self-maintaining. And this, as I say, has been largely discredited simply because the planet is far from equilibrium and getting farther in terms due to human activity. So we can't rely on the planet to take care of us if we just back off and leave things alone. Some people have interpreted that to mean we should be very active technologically now and doing radical things to make help our environment sustain us. But it certainly means that we need to be thinking very deeply about what kinds of values we're going to be able to engage with. And here are just two examples of that kind of discussion, two important interventions. On the left, Tim Kasser's work looking at young people and their value orientations and showing, in fact, that being very materialistic and achievement-oriented is a predictor of poor mental health over a 5 to 10 year period, whereas being oriented toward relationships and toward spirituality is a predictor of better mental health. So there's a clue on a very basic level for young people in North America at least, and there's some international work on this as well, to suggest that the values we live by and the values that in some way seem to be intrinsic to our economic system, to our ways of framing human problems, are themselves problematic in some ways and need to be challenged. Now on the right, a very important Indigenous voice, Sheila Watt-Cloutier, Inuk leader, who writes about the right to maintain a way of life that is tied to a particular kind of environment, and that in that sense, because of that sensitivity engagement with the environment, stands for a different set of values, a different set of priorities.